Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. It's great to see you all here. Thank you, everyone who's in chat, Crimson Clad and Patient Zero. Good to see you again. Revised Sociology and Swoop. Thank you very much for joining live. Thank you to anyone who's listening now or in the future. So it's good to be back for another episode. I have to admit that I hurt my foot a couple of days ago working on the land, so I've been a bit bedridden. But I'm glad that I made it and I can do this sitting down, so we should be okay. So this week, for those who've seen, and I posted about it, is the continuation of last week's episode. We're talking about surviving the apocalypse, or more specifically, really being able to prepare for any kind of dangers that are coming up in the future, in the unforeseen future. So, hang on, Swoop has a question. Do you think the coronavirus was manufactured? That's a good question. You know what, since it actually pertains to this week's topic, the coronavirus and pandemics in general, I'd like to take a few minutes to share my own views on the subject. Now, I have to say that I'm not an expert. I haven't researched the coronavirus specifically very much. I sort of more think about the coronavirus as I think about most of the pandemics and the pandemic scares that we've had over the last 10, 15 years. And it seems that we've had quite a few. So the corona, yes, I have to say I heard a little bit of Rondon's views on the subject, and I do certainly defer the authority to him, and he seems to be much more knowledgeable on the subject. So I'll talk more generally about pandemics, and that way I'll be able to stay off. If anything I say isn't true, it's just a more general expression. So the coronavirus apparently is some form of mutation. Is sort of linked to the swine flu, the virus that was, and the avian flu, the bird flu virus scare, which were quite, some time ago. But if you remember at the time, everyone was talking about it possibly developing into this global pandemic, and people were really worried about the virus's ability to go from animal to human and from human to human. So in terms of the statistics, from what I've seen, coronavirus does seem to be more, I think, more easily transferable and infecting more people. As for the number of deaths, there certainly seem to have been much fewer deaths with the bird flu and the swine flu, considering, the size of it and how long it was about. But even so, when you look at the deaths related to the coronavirus, they still seem to be rather small and insignificant. They're not that much more than other varieties of flu that we've come across, that when they attack people with a weak immune system, for whatever reason, children, elderly people, people who are ill, they're obviously can be very, very dangerous. But for most people, if you have a healthy immune system, I certainly believe much more in boosting our immune system and making it as robust and healthy as possible to be able to fight off as many different viruses and threats to the body as it can. And so the coronavirus, whatever it is, it's still a virus, it's still a form of the flu, and it's still something that our body technically should be able to fight off if we're healthy and if our immune system is functioning well enough. Obviously, that's a sweeping statement that won't always be true, but statistically speaking, I think a lot of the people who get harmed by these things and get harmed by other viruses or diseases, a lot of the time their immune system isn't as robust and as strong as it can be. And that also comes around from exposing it, as I was talking a little bit about last week, the same theory of exposing an organism to as much as possible in order to prepare for change, that's exactly how our immune system develops. Some people have sort of forgotten this with the medical theory of, adding to the immune system or adding to the body whatever is necessary in order to protect it in advance, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's medication, whether it's whatever that is doing the job instead of the body, that actually weakens the body's ability to do it itself. And when it comes to the immune system, if you've got an environment that isn't stimulating, that isn't challenging the immune system, then the immune system doesn't develop to be as strong and as robust. And when it might face a danger that it wasn't prepared for, it might be less able to deal with it and be more in danger. And so when it comes to the coronavirus, it's the same way I feel about other things. Certainly, there is a danger. I'm not trying to say that nothing is happening. I'm not trying to say that the whole thing is fake news or a hoax. But, if we talk statistically, people are more likely to die from a heart attack than they are from the coronavirus. But we don't see that same sort of scare and frenzy about the real dangers of a heart attack, about people being more healthy, working out, trying to take care of themselves. And the same is true of, cancer, for example, or many other diseases that are attacking so many more people and killing so many more than the coronavirus is. There's something very scary about a virus that can sweep off, and obviously science fiction films have made it a lot more sexy and, something that's quote unquote fun to think about than, say, heart disease, which means you have to go out for a run and you have to do cardio and you have to, very boring stuff. So I think that's why people obviously react much more to the coronavirus than they should do to the real threats in our lives. But it all pertains to the same thing, whether it's cancer, a heart attack, or the coronavirus. I think it's very important to prepare the body to be as healthy as possible, to do whatever we can to safeguard this vessel that we have in order for it to be able to deal with any dangers that might come, mutated viruses, diseases, or anything else. So that's my very, very unprofessional view of the subject, but thank you very much for the question, Swoop. Okay, sorry, just a minute. Excuse me, I'm still getting over a bit of a cold myself. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. The last week we sort of ended up, we were in the middle of different examples and how the ecoVillage model can face each of those. And before I continue with that list, I would like to take a moment to just separate two different categories that I think I might have skimmed over last episode. And so when we talk about surviving the apocalypse or being able to face any kind of dangers that come, we really have to split up what we want into two different categories. And those are necessities, the things that we actually need to survive, and amenities, the things that we really want, but in the face of survival, in the question of what do I need to live, another day, then we don't actually need these things. So just to be clear about it, water obviously is a necessity. Without water, we have very few days to survive. And electricity is an amenity. Obviously, in the ecoVillage model, we'll have electricity and we have a lot of plans in place for how to do this ecologically. But when it comes right down to it, in the case of some kind of crisis that comes, whether it's a natural disaster or any other kind, if we don't have electricity, but we have all the other systems independent of electricity, we have a water system and growing food and all of these things that don't depend on electricity to work, then we'll still be able to survive. So when we talk about surviving the apocalypse, we really are talking about, first of all, the necessities. What do we need to have in place in order to guarantee the survival of the ecoVillage in the face of different crises? And then the amenities, which are planning the ecoVillage to have what it needs, but obviously in the case of survival, those aren't things that we necessarily need to have. So I hope that cleared it up a little bit. And so I want to talk about one thing that it's actually interesting. The next danger that I want to talk about is drought. And when I was making out this list before the show, I wrote down drought, and later on I added flooding, because these two are very much connected. And I think that of the list of dangers, drought and therefore flooding are one of the most prevalent ones that we're seeing today. All over the world, people who are living near a river, and even people who are living far away from the water source, they're starting to see results of the flooding coming to them after periods of drought, and having the waters just wreaking havoc and causing chaos. And obviously in a relatively small scale compared to what it could be, but still something that's large enough. I was actually given an article today. My father showed me an article from the Times where they were talking about this idea of rewilding the areas around England in order to make the water, to allow the water to soak into the land more and not have it accumulate to such a rate that it actually causes flooding down the line. So there's this problem that they're facing with the floodings that's becoming so serious that they're actually considering what these longer term solutions could be to prevent the flooding. And so I have to admit that I was a little bit frustrated at how they were presenting this idea as if A, it's a very new concept that no one's ever talked about, and B, that wherever it was that they got it from, that was the place that invented it. I've heard a few people talking about this, technique of storing water in the land and slowing it to be able to allow more of it to infiltrate as originating somewhere over the last 100 years. This is, of course, nonsense. This is a very, very old concept. But I digress. We're talking about drought and the flooding that it can cause later. So here in Portugal, over the last few years, there were quite long periods of what they consider drought. This isn't technically drought because it was less than a year, less than 12 months of no rain. I think it was 10 or 11 months with no rain. But still, for the farmers here who are used to having their rain come like clockwork and come very heavily, it came as a bit of a shock. A lot of the wells that people use for their everyday use actually dried up. And of course, one of the big reasons for this is really the way that the Portuguese are managing the land. I mean, I was driving the other day and you could really see these channels that were dug where they were planting this, whatever it was, whether it was pine or whether eucalyptus, these huge rows and rows and rows, and all the rows were straight. And so in some places where the hill went down, the rows were perpendicular to the slope, and so they were stopping the water. But if you carried on the line, it goes to where the hill sort of circles around, and then the lines of the channels are just leading the water straight off the hill in the quickest route possible. Basically taking all of the water that falls and leading it away from the hill where they're trying to grow the trees. And it's just so upsetting to see that there's really no thought about what happens with the water. And this kind of behavior is what causes the land to hold less water, the trees to have less water, and this in turn can lead to having less rain. And so these periods of drought where the earth really dries up are usually followed by pretty heavy downpours, and those can actually seal the top layer of bare earth and become a real starting ground for floods. So this whole thing is happening now all over the world and is really causing a lot of damage as well. The solution to it, obviously, is what I've been talking about for a long time in many episodes: proper management of rainwater. And if you manage rainwater properly and store large enough amounts of it, the idea is that when you have the periods of flooding, you'll be able to handle the larger influx of rain, and it won't cause damage. It won't just wash over the land, eroding the topsoil, but you'll actually be able to store it, and whatever you can't store, you'll be able to safely lead away from your land. But on top of that, you'll actually be able to store the water for a later period, and in cases of drought, you'll have water that you'll be able to use on your land. So it solves both of the problems with one system. As soon as you begin managing the rainwater properly, you're really minimizing the occurrence of flooding, and you're minimizing the risk of a drought. So it's a very, very simple and impressive solution. I talk about it quite a lot on the show, and I think it really deserves that much attention. Okay, so let's move on to the next danger, as it were. And I think this one is something that's very common in the world today, and certainly here in Portugal, we've been dealing a lot with it, and that is the risk of fires. So obviously, droughts are also playing a big part in allowing fires to occur, and the landscape being much drier and not holding as much water also increases the chance of a large fire taking hold. And I'm not going to talk about the fires in Australia or the fires in the Amazon or the very large-scale fires that are occurring around the world, but I will talk specifically about Portugal, since that's where we are, and the fire risk affects our land specifically. When I first proposed that we should move to Portugal, most of the people I told, the first thing they said was, what about the fires? And obviously that's a very real concern that most people have heard about. And what I would say, and what I still stand by today, is that there is definitely a higher risk of fires in Portugal, but at the same time that allows us to know what the dangers are, and therefore to be able to prepare for the highest risk that we're basically facing here with our land. And so yes, there's a high risk of fires, but that's something that we can prepare for, and we can do a lot of work beforehand in order to prevent. And so it's become a very big part of the plan for the land since the beginning. And a few weeks ago now, I think, or maybe a month, a while back, we've actually discovered that the land is in a whole zone which is categorized as a high fire risk. I wrote about this in one of the posts, and because of that, we can't actually get building permits to build a home. We can build different kinds of buildings on the land, we can do most of what we want there, but we can't get a permit for something that's called a residence on the land. And so this is sort of a general new law that the Portuguese government really decided in a state of panic, because people were being killed by the fires and they were really out of control. They didn't know what to do, and it's a very easily presentable piece of legislation where you can say, this is what we're doing, we have this law, and if you're in a fire zone, you can't build your residence. But that law doesn't actually change the situation on the land at all. And so we're in this situation along with other people in Portugal, where we have a piece of land that is designated as a high fire risk, and therefore we can't live on it. So what many people are doing, and what we're also, we're considering, is selling the land because it's in a high fire risk, or at least buying another property that isn't, and just eliminating the problem. Now this means that the high fire risk pieces of land aren't being treated, they're not worked to lower the risk in any way. They're simply being left in the state that they are and being designated as a high fire risk. Now this isn't actually helping the situation at all. It's not doing anything to change it. It's just a bureaucratic name tag. So what we're proposing, and we're actually working alongside an architect here, is we've got a rather extensive fire plan that we want to implement on the land, and this plan will actually decrease the fire risk. And so I won't go into it too much over here because it's really very specific, but generally speaking, the three areas that we deal with are the border of the land. So every piece of land should protect itself from external fires, which is obviously how fires spread to become so big. And that means a border that will be designed in order to prevent a fire. and then around the living area, around the actual house, you'll have another sort of smaller border designed also to prevent a fire that might be on the land or might have gotten from outside to actually reach the house itself. And on top of that, throughout the whole land, there will be this design of holding as much water as possible on top and below the earth, which is something that I've talked about so much, and we talked about in relation to drought and flooding. Well, wouldn't you know, it also helps to prevent fires. And so having this plan in place and actually implementing it nationwide, or at least in fire risk areas in Portugal, I think, and I believe statistically speaking can be shown, it can really change the likelihood of a large-scale fire getting out of control. Even if a fire starts and even if it grows, the more of these areas and lands that there are, the more it can actually slow the fire from spreading and help be able to deal with it. So that's just a little something about fires, since A, they're a risk that can happen in a lot of different places, and B, specifically, we suffer from it in Portugal. Okay, I'm going to do a quick check on the chat. I can just see Lacking asked, do they do controlled burns in Portugal? Yes, they do a lot of slash and burn. They have a certain period of the year where it's illegal to do fires on your land, obviously in the hot seasons in the summer. But it's very, very common practice, and until recently it was completely unregulated, very common practice to burn the whatever you're cutting off from your land. And obviously now with a new law in place, everyone is required to maintain their land, and if it's overgrown, you have to cut it down, you have to get rid of all of the overbrush. And what people are doing with the overbrush is just burning it. So in an effort to improve the safety, lower the fire risk and actually clean the land, the law means we're increasing the likelihood of a fire, as we're having lots and lots of these quote-unquote controlled burns in Portugal. Now, on top of that, of course, from what I've heard, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of money in fighting the fires. There are all sorts of rumors of people starting fires in order to get grants and reimbursement and all these different things. So there is that as well. But regardless of what the start is, regardless of what the the initial cause of the fire, this is still a very good practice to have, generally speaking, and everywhere. There's really no downside, unless, of course, you're in a tremendously wet area where the earth is already saturated and then you're trying to drain it. But in most places in the world today, and definitely in all the deserts, we could all really benefit from holding as much water as we can. So, let me just have the... Okay, there's a few links here. I'm afraid I can't go through all of them now. So we're going to carry on. If you have any questions about anything I've said or anything you want me to go back or clear up, please post and I'll try and read through them. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is one of the easier problems for us to tackle, and that is food shortage. Now, obviously today, living in the West the way that we do, it's hard to imagine ever having a food shortage, but it's interesting to see sort of little signs of it just before. Like there was a butter shortage. I'm not sure who here or who listening may have been aware of this, but it was certainly in Israel. I heard that it was in Europe. I can't remember exactly where it was affecting, but there was this sort of global feeling that suddenly butter was something that was very hard to find and it was, scarce, etc. Now, obviously, that's a very small scale, and it happened because of pricing and because of, different export rules, etc. It wasn't that there was no more butter. But if we can imagine a state where, for whatever reason, whether the source of the food for some reason doesn't produce, or whether the methods for shipping the food, moving the food to where it is, delivering it doesn't work, for whatever reason, when we assume that so easily this, system could stop providing food for us, stop providing this very necessary part, it's very easy to see why we would want to replace that with our own production of food. So I don't think there's any reason to talk anymore about the subject, since growing our own food is one of the most, I think, common practices of the eco-village that we have today, accepted worldwide. The next one that I want to talk about is really a huge subject in and of itself, and I mean, maybe I'll take an episode to dedicate specifically to this subject, but for now we're going to go through it relatively quickly, and that is what's called peak oil, or basically reaching a point where the oil starts running out to the point where there is no more. So I think this is another one of those dangers that's very, very hard for people to predict, very hard for people to even imagine happening. The thought of not having oil, well, the production and the real use of oil is so far from us usually. It's really not in our consciousness in any way. So it's very easy to understand why it would feel so distant from us. But the fact of the matter is, whenever it may happen, there is a certain amount of oil that took millions of years to be produced, and we have been taking it out of the ground and have been doing so at larger and larger quantities for the past, over 100 years. I mean, the amount of production of oil today and use is still growing exponentially, it seems, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So whatever amount of oil we have left is decreasing at a faster and faster rate. That's what we know for sure. In terms of how much is left and how long, I think it really varies in terms of the experts, and it's hard to say for sure. But they do say that there's a very small likelihood of finding any more very large-scale deposits. Obviously, this is hard to say for sure, but you can see when they start looking in places like the Antarctica or Alaska, they're obviously getting rather desperate. So, when oil runs out, when peak oil, let's imagine for a moment that it doesn't happen gradually, but it actually comes as somewhat of a surprise. The hope is that as the oil runs out, people become more and more aware that this is a possibility, and whatever it is, the government or the factories or the people in charge change their ways and depend on oil less and less over time until we actually make the transition peacefully. I hope that that's the way it happens. But imagining for a moment that that's not the way it happens, and we actually face the lack of oil or oil shortages as has happened in the past. I should just iterate, right, as I'm speaking of this, I suddenly realize I've written peak oil because that's the term that I know. Oil is the American term for what, whether you call it petrol or crude oil, I think would be the correct term. So we're talking about the black oil that comes out of the ground, just to be clear. And so we have to face the fact that in our society, there is very little that goes on without any involvement of this oil, whether it's in the production of the materials, whether it's in the machines that are used to gather resources in the first place, all the way to shipping them through different factories and refineries until it finally ends up in our house as a finished product. All of that process requires an enormous amount of oil in order for it to really function. And so the solution to this is obviously held in all the other things that we've been talking about with the eco-village, and that is alleviating ourselves from the dependency on these external systems. All of these external systems, our food production, our water systems, our waste management, our electricity, all of them rely on oil in some way or another, or on coal, but most of it is oil, and certainly there isn't enough coal right now to replace all the things that it does. So the easiest and the best solution to solve a lot of these problems is weaning ourselves off of this dependency, producing our own food, collecting our own water, providing our own needs, and that way when oil, when it actually runs out, whenever that is, we'll be in a situation where we'll be able to survive without that dependency. Obviously, this means that when it comes to producing electricity, if you don't have a system that you can create yourself or renew yourself, if you're relying on electronic parts, any kind of fabrication by factories, it's going to be something to consider when we talk about not having those as an option anymore. But that's for another subject. Talking about peak oil in general, the sooner we can reach a state where we're no longer dependent on these external systems, the more ready we'll be if and when this may happen. Okay, we're at the halfway mark now. I call Patient Zero says we call it Texas tea in America, and we don't drink tea because of Tea Party from a long, long time ago. Well said. Okay, so the next subject that I want to talk about is actually a rather interesting subject, and I've spoken about it with a few people before, and it's something that is very hard for people, I think, to sort of accept or really. I mean, it's incredible. So this is the subject of radiation, and whether you're aware of this or not, I think it's important to realize that all of the world's dealing with nuclear technology in whatever form, whether it's war related or whether it's energy production. It has a certain price, and that price is the rise in radiation levels in certain areas. And obviously, radiation can actually travel, through water, through air, be carried with it. And so, when we think about disasters that have happened, like Fukushima, it's amazing how we sort of just forget past occurrences to the point where it's like, well, there's so many new dangers coming up that it's hard to really focus on all of the past ones that we had, like, bird flu and swine flu. But with the Fukushima, for those who don't remember, I'm sorry, I should actually say, the Fukushima nuclear power plant was a Japanese plant that had a disastrous malfunctioning that caused the whole nuclear reactor to sort of, what's it called when it powers down? To have a meltdown. And it actually had a hole in the plant that was leaking radiation into the sea around it. Now, this leaking has been going on. I haven't checked it recently, but I mean, a couple of months ago when I checked, it's still leaking radiation for the past, who knows, what is it, like 10 years? I should really be checking all of this data. But if someone can look it up in chat, when did Fukushima actually happen? For all of these years, there's been this enormous amount of radiation washing into the water, into the ocean. And this water in the ocean is obviously the water that travels all around the world. So we have increasing levels of radiation just from that, not talking about all the nuclear testings that can go on, the bombings that go out in the desert or whatever facilities that they may be. And so it's certainly a certain concern that we should be thinking about if we're talking about surviving the apocalypse, if we're talking about really being able to face certain dangers. I think we need to at least be aware of this problem. And so technologically speaking, there's all sorts of these suits and lead and all sorts of technological innovations that can really help face an actual crisis of radiation. But there's another solution that I actually want to focus on, and it might be one that's a little less known. And that's part of the reason I think it's so important to talk about. In another nuclear crisis area, Chernobyl, they've discovered a few years back a new species of fungi. And this fungus seemed to be feeding on the radiation. And so they've actually been studying this species since then, and they've discovered some interesting facts. They don't actually know how it works, biologically speaking, but what they do know, they theorize that it's similar to photosynthesis, in the same way that plants take the sun's light and convert that light into biological energy that they can use for growing, etc. These fungi seem to be taking the radiation and converting it into a form of organic matter they can actually use. Yes, well done. Who is this that sent it? I can't remember. Patient Zero, thank you for sharing. In 2007, researchers discovered a fungus at Chernobyl that uses the biological pigment melanin, exactly, to feed on radiation. And they've actually discovered in testings in laboratories since then that it excels. I mean, it actually does better with radiation than a species that isn't exposed to it. So this was mind-boggling to me. I mean, everything I seem to have learned as a child about what's possible and what's impossible is not true. You know, radiation kills. That's all it does. That's all we've ever heard. It kills everything. Nuclear winter. In none of the sci-fi stories that I ever read, you know, and 20 years later the mushrooms had lowered the radiation levels enough for people to be able to survive without the suits. You know, it's crazy. By the way, that'd be a good story if anyone out there is listening. I'd like to read that. The radiotrophic fungus, exactly. So this is a subject that, I mean, there is obviously a lot more to think about the applications of this, you know, in terms of a nuclear winter ensuing and how do we actually prepare, and radiation will obviously kill us even if there are mushrooms around. But the same thought, and I've spoken about this a few times before, about myco-remediation, different techniques, natural techniques that are available using fungi to cure, to remediate the land and the earth. And so fungus being able to clean the environment from radiation enough to make it ready for other species to survive is certainly a very good example of that, I think. So if any of you have radioactive lands or something that you want to, you know, get rid of, think about buying a couple of these fungi. No, I'm joking. They're not available for sale. Although I'd love to look into buying the different species. If anyone has a link, there's also a species that actually eats plastic. So we'll talk. I think I spoke about that last episode as well. Yeah. So those are definitely species that are worth investing in. Okay, so that's basically the list that I prepared of different dangers that the ecoVillage model can help us prepare for. And now for the final part of the episode, I'd like to talk about something a little different in general. This subject of preparing for apocalypse, preparing for some kind of global crisis is a I think, dividing concept. There are half the people who almost live their lives around this subject, you know, the preppers, etc. And there are half the people who just think they're completely crazy and carry on with their lives completely as usual. I think, or I feel, that there may be a growing middle of people who aren't quite preppers, who are buying up, you know, stocking on weapons, but they are trying to change the way they live in order to be better, to be more prepared for the future. But still, it's a very dividing subject when you talk about the apocalypse, when you talk about actual doomsday survival, you know, concepts. And I've been talking about this, I can't remember now, but for quite some time, for a few years, and I've had many different conversations with people about how do you best prepare and if it's necessary and is it worth even thinking about in this way. And most of the people who I've spoken with really get sort of flustered. They really can't really understand what the big deal is when we're talking about these big apocalyptic changes that might happen. And I'm not sure exactly why people react that way, but I feel it has something to do with the fact that there is a certain need inside of us to live in this belief of stability and this belief that tomorrow when I wake up, things are going to carry on in the same way. And obviously this belief and this ability to recognize patterns and to build up stability from repetition is something that's essential for our consciousness, for the way we think, for our survival. But at the same time, it can also be a certain trap in a certain way of thinking about it. Sorry, just one moment. Excuse me, sorry, I missed the mute button there. A certain way to think about it is that when we refuse to see the changes that are coming, we actually don't prepare as well for it. And so when I talk to people about this, there's another reaction that I get very, very often. And that reaction is really people who are talking about the problem of what other people are doing in this state of emergency. And so whatever the apocalypse, whatever the crisis scenario, there's always the question of the crowd, the people, the other ones who are trying to survive. And so whenever I speak to people about this, very often they'll say to me, there's a great stand-up bit by Bill Burr who talks about, it's great to have a windmill and saving seeds and all these things, but really all you're doing is gathering supplies for the toughest guy on the block, because ultimately he's going to come and he's just going to take whatever you've stored. And I've faced that mentality in many, many different people that have this innate belief that as long as you're not ready for war, basically, if you don't have a fortress that you can defend with firearms, that you can withstand any attack, then you're not really going to survive. All you're going to be able to do is survive until somebody comes and robs you. And it's this mentality that I want to talk about a little bit here and maybe end the episode on. At the end of the last episode, I was talking a little bit about my beliefs and about what I think we can do. And I think a few people in chat said that I was being rather optimistic in the nicest way. I think they were meant to say it as a compliment. But nonetheless, it made me realize that I am perceived as being rather optimistic, especially when I talk about doomsday preparation. Doomsday preparation is normally seen as something that, is very frightening, is very dangerous, is very unpredictable, and therefore something that, although we're preparing for, we're really hoping in a way, that it won't happen, and we're quite frightened of the outcome. And that's not the way I feel about the, impending apocalypse. I wouldn't say I'm looking forward to it, but I certainly see the value of, these crises happening in the natural world. So we can easily see in a system that we don't feel connected to, and we're not talking about human systems, but natural systems. Forests, ecosystems, different species, there occur these crises that happen and really change the system and really destroy something that was there. And then ultimately, every time what happens is it allows for something new to grow and take its place. And so this process of destruction and creation seems to be a very common element that we see around us. And obviously, when we think about people getting hurt, when we think about human systems being destroyed, it's much harder for us to remain as calm and collected about it. But I still feel the same philosophy applies. And I think that if we really want to change the current system, however that change may be, it forces the quote-unquote destruction of the older system. I don't mean going down there and burning it with torches, but in order for a new system to form, an old system must stop being. And so whatever the future holds, whether it's a very peaceful transition or whether it's a much more sudden transition, let's say, I really do believe that this transition is a good thing, because it will be pushing humanity and the state on Earth forward. So when I talk to people about this preparation and they say to me things like, the people aren't ready. If there is this state, if there is this huge panic, this crisis, this fight for survival, then everyone is going to revert back to the animalistic state of this, survival of the strongest, and I'll do whatever I have to do. I'll step on anyone I have to. And that's where I think I disagree with a lot of these people. And this is obviously my personal belief. There's no real way to prove it yet. And let's say I hope I don't have to. But I really do believe that if we have this eco-village in place, and hopefully if we have many of these eco-villages in place, then what would happen is that there would be this crisis and people wouldn't have their basic needs and they would have to survive. And let's assume for the moment that a group of these people would happen upon one of these eco-villages. Let's say they're even carrying weapons, ready for doing whatever it takes in order for them to survive, basically. When they happen upon one of these eco-villages, obviously, in my mind, this is a pacifist place, and so there are no weapons because there's no need to defend ourselves. But, our weapon of choice, as it were, is non-violent communication. And as the name suggests, certainly a pacifist technique, I think. But I really do believe that if you come to a group of people who are fighting to survive and you tell them, look, we have an eco-village here that's designed and set up to provide everything that we need. We have clean water, fresh water, food, shelter. We even have, to a certain degree, let's say power, electricity. All of this can be yours. You're welcome to use it. There's no need for any violence. You don't need to fight to take it. We're actually welcoming you to join us. And I really do believe that the majority of people, especially if you consider people being torn from an everyday society that we know to a survival state where they don't know where their next food is going to come from. They don't know where their next drink is going to come from. If these people happen upon a thriving, peaceful community that welcomes them with open arms and invites them to join, for a feast to celebrate their coming, it's hard for me to imagine that these people would rather choose a violent path to deal with it. Now, having said that, statistically speaking, can I imagine that some group of people somewhere will definitely choose a more violent path just because they're destructive? That's certainly a possibility. But I think that on the whole, when you ask most people what they want, they don't want a life of violence. They don't want to have to fight. They don't want to have to work tremendously hard to survive. What they want is to have a safe environment for them to live happily and to fulfill themselves. And they want to have all of their needs taken care of, whatever that means to a certain degree, but definitely the basic survival needs. So if you offer people that at any state in humanity, at any stage, whether it's now in the current society or after an apocalyptic event when people have lost so much, I really think that most people would prefer to choose to have a peaceful life together rather than a life of violence. Okay, I can see one question here that seems to be in regard to what I was saying. Rondon asks, what I don't understand is why people who don't know when their next meal is coming from or where to get clean drinking water are the same people that have 10 kids. It seems to be psychopathy from my perspective. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I have a bit that I could say about that. Okay, I'm going to answer it as quickly as I can, and this is only my personal opinion, but it depends on what kind of people you're talking about. If you're talking about people who don't have clean drinking water and they're part of a more traditional society, then a lot of the times, if you look at the people who are having 10 kids today, most of them are doing so for religious reasons to a certain degree. So we can't forget that in most of history, people weren't having kids so that they would all survive. They were actually having enough kids so that some of them would survive. And I really think that mentality, Swoop is saying it's a survival strategy, exactly. That mentality of providing, of having enough children so that some of them survive is actually better achieved by having a lot of children than having fewer. Exactly. Swoop says, yeah, there you go. So I've been backed up by Swoop. I feel okay. Okay, I can see I've got 11 minutes left. And so if anyone in chat has any more questions or enlightenments that they want to talk about, I'd be happy to read them through. In the meantime, I'm just going to end on the final note that I wanted to say, which is, because I have written down little sentences, so I spoke all about people preparing in that way, but I actually haven't encapsulated it, as it were. I think that when people talk about prepping, doomsday preppers and being ready for the apocalypse, they often think about preparing for war, having the guns, having the armor, having the safe house, whatever it is, being ready for when the government, the people, the soldiers come knocking down with weapons. And I think that if we look throughout history, we see there's a certain arc of, a kind of learning curve of morality, where morality evolved over time to make it better for more people, as it were. And so in the beginning, it was very much a fighting society in smaller and smaller groups. And then people realized, oh, if we form larger groups working together for the same cause, we can actually achieve greater things until the age of empires, etc. And today we're realizing, you know what? Actually, if everyone lived together peacefully and nobody fought, that would probably be the best for most people, for everyone. And so we see this learning curve of people leaning more and more towards that mentality. So when people say to me, oh, as soon as the apocalypse occurs, we're going to go back to the dark ages, we're going to go back to the way things used to be, all these sci-fi movies where you see humans very quickly going back to the state of basically animals, I'm not sure that has to be the case. Certainly it's a danger. We've seen throughout history how quickly people can turn there. But people almost always turn to that decision because of environmental pressures, whatever they may be. And if you have an environment, if you have surroundings that provides the opposite of that, that invites people, instead of becoming animals, to actually maintain their humanity, I think it has a much better chance of working. And so when I'm thinking about the eco-village model and how I want to prepare for the possible apocalyptic future, I would rather be preparing for an unknown time, for an unprecedented period of peace, where everyone could actually have the abundance that they need in order to survive. And because of that, there aren't as many people going around who are trying to steal and harm and be violent and do what they need in order to survive. So that's just my personal belief. I'm sure that some people wouldn't feel the same, but let's wait and see what happens in the future. So let's have a look through chat very quickly. Definitely. Okay, talking more about the conversation that was before. So I think that's been most of what I wanted. I'll tell you what, if we have a few more minutes, I just want to share a quick link to Bill Burr's bit, if you haven't heard it, because it's very good. But this is exactly the sort of mentality that I'm talking about when people are talking about preparing for doomsday. It's this mentality of having to, defend ourselves against the other people who are facing that reality. And I think the eco-village model, the beauty of it is that it would function in exactly the same way before a crisis occurs, in the everyday modern times that we know now, and after a crisis occurs. Because the whole idea of the eco-village model is to have a certain protective bubble that allows it to survive and to stay afloat in whatever times of stress may be going on outside. And this is only really possible once you have a system that's sort of autonomous to a certain degree and that is really able to take care of all of its necessities without having to rely on any external sources. Sorry for just 1 minute. I do apologize about this cough. I hope that by next week I'll be much better in getting over it. Okay, wonderful. So let's see. We're still talking about the chat. Yeah, I mean, you know what? If you've already mentioned it, we're talking about it in chat. I'd like to say just one thing about the whole thought of having too many children and how can we get people to have fewer. This is a situation that arises in Israel a lot as well. In Israel, as with many of these cases, it's sort of split between the two types of people: the more religious, who obviously encourage more children, and having a large family is part of what the Jewish God wants. And on the other side, you have these people who are having fewer children or even not having children at all, who really believe that having so many children is not the right thing to do ecologically and that we can't support it as a society. And I think, in a way, that I disagree with both sides. Um, I certainly think that people having children just because somebody told them to is a bad idea. That goes for anyone, whether it's teenagers or cult members or religious people or whatever it is. If the reason you're having a child is because somebody else told you that's a good thing, I think you should have a long, hard think about it first. But when it comes to the planet's ability to sustain people, and as we know, we're at a record breaking 7 billion, closing to 8, I think, in sometime soon, if I read. Um, it's a good question about how many people the planet can actually support. But I think that the systems that we have now that are supporting most of humanity really aren't large enough, aren't efficient enough to be able to do the job. And one of the reasons is that the lands that they require are so vast and they really don't manage to allow a good integration of people living where they're growing their food. And so again, the eco-village model could really provide a very good solution to how many more people could live in the same place, because you don't have these huge structures or these huge growing plains growing all of the food for everyone. You actually have it integrated as part of where people are living. On top of that, I will say that I very much agree with what Terence McKenna said, which is, he spoke about it once and said that the mushroom told him the answer when he talked about overpopulation and what the solution should be. He said, for one generation, every woman must have no more than one child. Not every woman, but any woman who wants children must have no more than one. And this would halve the human population within 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't check the math, but whatever the actual solution is, it certainly seems to me that if we did that very, very simple solution on some scale, doesn't even have to be large scale, everyone, but on some scale, that would put a dramatic change to the number of people that were around. And so if some of the people who have children because they're told, or who have children because, they can't afford clean water or clean food and they don't have access to it, those people would definitely be able to change their decision if they were exposed to a project like the eco-village, if they had somewhere where they could live, where they could choose the number of children they want based on whatever they feel. So for me personally, I think that that's the solution. Okay, thank you very, very much for joining me for another episode. It's been wonderful. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something. I've been Olev. This has been the Discomfort Zone podcast, and I'll see you all next week.